Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and on Sundays I do a thing called Books and Booze where I review a book and mix up a cocktail. It is the last Sunday of the month, so I am moving into my exploration of religion, making this week's book The World's Religions by Huston Smith. Now, I looked and could not find a cocktail that I was excited to try and match with this week's book, but as I was wandering around Total Wine the other day trying luck into a case of Hulk Hogan's All-American beer for my husband because the Hulk died. My husband's a huge wrestling fan. He was very sad. He likes Hulk Hogan's beer, so I thought maybe I can buy him a case of beer, and that was a dumb idea because everybody else had the exact same thought. But as I was wandering around, I came across this little offering, which is by, I'm assuming that's Paperback Brewery. It's called Satan Wears Pajamas. It's an American red ale. And their little catchphrase here says, "Eternal damnation is too long to not be comfortable," with a little devil on the front. The artwork is adorable. I'm not going to lie, it's kind of why I bought it. That and, Satan and religion and, sure, why not? So let's do this. Plus, weirdly, I just realized this, color matching there. I mean, Huston Smith that's not satanic. Those are Buddhist monks praying, all right? Even I knew that, even without reading this book. I knew those were Buddhist monks praying. But oranges and reds and blacks, they match. So I'm matchy-matchy today. Should have worn an orange top. I don't have any orange tops. Orange is not really a good color on me. I'm babbling. In The World's Religions, Smith looks at 7 very specific religions, all right? He looks at Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And then he throws in an additional chapter at the end that loosely addresses what he calls primal religions, i.e. Aboriginal tribes in Australia, Native American tribes, and even, very briefly, he one time mentions Shinto. We're going to come back to why that's irritating to me very shortly. Basically, religions that don't necessarily have a written word are what he considers primal religions. That's a very loose translation there. And then he gives a fairly brief overview of each of the above religions, which was interesting for Hinduism and Buddhism, even for Taoism. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, I'm from the West. I already have a very basic understanding of each of those, regardless of whether or not I grew up in those faiths, which nominally Christian growing up. Confucianism was confusing. Yes, Confucianism was confusing. Let's try this. That's a very good amber ale. That's a very good amber ale. All right, I enjoy that one. That's pretty tasty. Glad I bought a 4-pack. I could have just gone out on a limb and bought just one, but glad I bought the 4-pack. So, Confucianism, why is it confusing? I mean, it felt... First off, it felt like a stretch, more like he was describing a philosophy than a religion. I mean, even in the examples he gives, like in Hinduism, Buddhism, he draws parallels to things you might find in Christianity. But for Confucianism, he directly compares it to Plato. He actually says that would be the closest analog to Greek thought would be Plato. Plato was not a religion, he was a philosopher, quite famous one. Confucian is known as a famous philosopher, but I never would have thought of him as being a religious movement. So that was very confusing to me. In the chapter on Confucianism, he refers repeatedly to Japan. Not quite sure why. Confucius was Chinese. Out of curiosity, as I'd like to see if I was missing something, I went to what is probably one of the most definitive sources of who worships what anywhere, and that is the CIA World Factbook. Why do I say this is definitive? Because the CIA World Factbook is just reporting what those countries say directly about themselves and their own, religious preferences. And according to the CIA, Japan is 48.6 Shinto, 46.4% Buddhist, 1.1 Christian, and 4% other as of 2021. So those are fairly recent statistics. They include a note that the percentage is more than 100%. Like if you add all those together, you're going to come up to a little over 100%, because some people claim more than one affiliation, which just based on those numbers are most likely going to be a Shinto-Buddhist blend. So what is missing from that list would be Confucianism is nowhere mentioned in Japan's religious beliefs. We're going to come back to why that's relevant in a very short minute of time here. The CIA lists Confucianism under traditional beliefs. Doesn't even say it's a religion necessarily, just that it's a traditional belief, along with other traditional beliefs which include animism, shamanism, and spiritualism. Smith, incidentally, considers shamanism a form of primal religion. Okay, I mean, those those could literally just be differences in opinion, and not necessarily just between the CIA and Smith per se, because the CIA frankly has no vested interest in this one way or the other. Their only concern is how do the religious affiliations of various nations or populations, how those might impact national security of the United States. That's their only interest in it. But it's interesting news, right? It's interesting to see. This is what the breakdown is. Smith was a religious scholar, but decidedly not a political or economic scholar. Why do I say that? And why is it relevant? What makes me bring this up? What makes me bring up that he is not an economic or historical scholar or political scholar? Well, back to his chapter on Confucianism. I had a real problem with Confucianism here. No disrespect to Confucianists. I am going to study it independently of Mr. Smith's offerings. I fully intend to read up on Confucianism and say, hey, is this just a political philosophy? But this is where his book kind of went off the rails, and it was very early on because this was the third chapter in the book, went off the rails. In his chapter on Confucianism, Smith says, quote, facing up to its population problem in the third quarter of this century, meaning the 20th century, China halved her birth rate in a single decade, and in the 30 years from 49 to 79 put famine, flood, and epidemic disease behind a quarter of the world's population seemingly forever, because China, of course, was very populous, making about a quarter of the world's population. So this was very confusing to me because he, as far as I understand, was born to missionary parents in China. I mean, I don't know that he was born in China, but he certainly spent several formative years there, years during which he should have seen what exactly Marxism was doing to that country. He even ends the chapter by stating his belief that Confucius will outlive Chairman Mao, but those two sentences, you know, the population of the 20th century and China having her birth rate and the famine, flood, and epidemic, those two sentences within the context of what was written in the chapter as a whole and the paragraph around it particularly seems to indicate that Mao was influenced by Confucius rather than the far more cynical and evil Karl Marx, which is absolutely, categorically, provably 100% false. Like, we know for an absolute fact that Marx was the driving force, that Marx's political theory was the driving force behind everything that happened to China from 49 on. It was most decidedly not Confucius that put famine, flood, and epidemic disease behind a quarter of the world's population. It was Marx. And this was not a good thing. Why would that possibly be a bad thing to put those behind you, right? That sounds horrible to say. It's horrible to say that, no, man, famine's a good thing. Well, Marx's political theory did not allow for the innovation of finding ways to abolish those three things through, like, better farming practices, for example. In fact, as we've learned from Mao's Great Famine that I read a few years back, famine was put behind China by starving to death 45 million people in a 4-year span, right? It's real easy to put famine behind you when there's no one left to eat the food. Ditto for epidemic. Everyone's already dead from famine, so there's nobody left to transmit the diseases. I was very irritated with this book by this point in time, which made me actually just finish reading it this morning because I had a very hard time picking it up again and suspending my disbelief to get around it, basically. So those two sentences regarding the, birth rate and famine and all of that, it was willfully disingenuous for somebody who grew up in Marxist China to make such a statement. I shouldn't say that. Did he grow up in Marxist China? He grew up in China, but it may have actually been pre-Marxism. When was Huston Smith born? Now I have to find this out, because maybe it wasn't willfully disingenuous. Maybe it was just intellectually dishonest because he was part of the, university system here in the United States. And they all love to kiss the Marxist ass. Oh, he was born in China. He was born in 1919 in Suzhou, China. So, all right, maybe he didn't actually grow up around Marxist China. All right, well, let's be fair here. He does have an autobiography. I am not at all sure that I'm going to be reading it, but he may not have actually grown up in Marxist China, but he certainly saw what Marxism did to China, and so I'm going to say instead of willfully disingenuous, it was intellectually dishonest. Probably because of his university leanings, university background. Those two sentences were just so intellectually dishonest. Let's change this right now. So intellectually dishonest in light of how he ends the chapter with his statement, R.E. Mao versus Confucius, that I kind of lost a bit of respect for him. So, halved her birth rate. That was the other fun statement he made. Halved their birth rate. Yay, Confucius. Again, not quite. It was quite famously China's single-child policy. All right, this one has been on and off the news, so you may or may not be aware of it. From 1979 to 2015. So for 36 years, China had a policy in place that each couple could only have one child. Except Chinese culture had a very definite preference for boy babies. So girls who were born, if they were born, because they had sonograms, they would know if it was a boy or girl. They could choose to abort based on selective gender, and that is profoundly evil. They were any girls that were born were either adopted out to other countries or just killed because, hey, it was a girl and nobody needs a girl, they need boys because family honor or whatever bull crap they put up with. I don't know. I'm being cynical here and probably unfairly judging China because I don't know. I haven't read necessarily about the policy. I know enough about it to say this did happen, but not enough to say what necessarily the Chinese mores were around it. So I'll back off that topic a little bit. I will say that the policy was revoked in 2015 because China realized that they were not having enough girl babies to literally birth the next generation of China. So yes, they have their population and controlled that population growth. Well done, Karl Marx and Chairman Mao. I somehow doubt that the slow death of China by attrition was Confucius's plan. Pretty sure that was nowhere in his planning. Now, I don't know enough about India's history individually to have an opinion on whether or not there were these sort of factual errors in his chapters on Hinduism and Buddhism. I do have a book on India, have not read it yet, but it's a big fat book. It's like 1,000 pages. It's going to be a month-long read for that one. There's no way I'm reading it in a week. He did say, Mr. Smith did, that Buddhism is not practiced in India anymore, mostly because those practitioners have been reabsorbed into the mother religion, which was Hinduism. And remember where I said that I would come back to the CIA fact book and how their numbers were relevant? Here's why. That statement is supported by the CIA fact book. In India, the populations there practice Hinduism at 79.8%, Islam at 14.2%, Christianity at 2.3%, and Sikh at 1.7%. Other unspecified at 2% as of 2011. So, not as recent of the data, but still, that's where we're at. So, his statement there is supported, which makes me, again, very baffled as to why he was so intent on including Japan as part of Confucianism when they don't even seem to have heard the man's name. They practiced Shintoism. And while the chapter on Taoism did not go as off the rails as the chapter on Confucianism, by the time we got to Tao, my skepticism had popped up, because that was after Confucius. Not in religion in general. I do actually feel that religion is important. I do think that it is good for the human soul to have faith in something. But as to the general intellectual honesty of Mr. Smith, I was highly skeptical by this point. So I was salty already going into the chapters on Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Now, in the very beginning of the book, like the prologue, right? He said that he was going to focus on the positive aspects of each religion and stay away from the salacious, which, and the thought stayed in my mind because I kind of already knew that he wasn't going to go too into depth into the bad things that, say, Islam and Christianity have managed to do. I just assumed, though, that he did that to avoid discussing the Kama Sutra when it came to Hinduism. That thought kind of went out of the window when he mentioned Tantra during the chapter on Buddhism. Not as many people are aware of this as, say, the hippies in the 1960s would be, but if you Google tantric sex, well, that's kind of where the idea comes from, is, Tantra Buddhism. I have a book on tantric sex. I'm debating if I want to read that as part of religious studies or just spend a month blushing reading about sex lives. I haven't decided yet. I'm kind of blushing already just thinking about it, so I'm not sure yet. Can't control my crying. Why should I be able to control the blushing? I quickly realized that disclaimer was his attempt at intellectual honesty. Excuse me, let me rephrase that because my stress was on the wrong word there. That disclaimer was his attempt at intellectual honesty rather than dishonesty. Excuse me, because if he goes into the chapter on Islam discussing the shit show that is the Middle East, he would then have to discuss the absolute blood-soaked history of Christianity. So comparatively, the chapters on Islam, Judaism, and Christianity were fairly dull. They are all Judaism came first, all right? It is the mothership, if you will, of the other two religions, followed by Christianity. And then, of course, after that, about 700 years later, came Islam with Muhammad and his Sermon on the Mount and all of that. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he did. All of that. So those three religions are intertwined. I do think that the book Mr. Smith that I read last month, he said something about the major problems the Middle East have less to do with religion and more to do with land and territorial disputes. I think that probably was a spot-on statement, because in an idealized perfect world, these three religions would embrace each other as brothers and sisters, because they are closely intertwined to some degree. And we will learn more about that as I get to those various religions during my own journey here, right? In a perfect world, of course, none of these religions are the absolute soul of perfection. Like I said, the things going on in the Middle East with Islam are absolutely horrifying. The positive intent that may have been initially present when Muhammad birthed this religion have long since been removed with the absolute suppression of women and rights in the Middle East. And that is a hill that I may end up dying on, depending on if I piss off the wrong Muslims. Just thinking of you, Charlie Hebdo. Judaism, a lot going on with Israel right now. Zionism is a thing. Again, don't know enough about that to necessarily have an opinion one way or the other. I did put Zionism down, even though that's technically a political movement. I put that down under my branch of Judaism to study, because while it's technically a political movement, it's very heavily influenced by the religion. So that's going to fall under Judaism when I get there. And of course, Christianity has had 2,000 years of blood and death backing it up. So none of those are exactly clean religions, if by clean you mean not completely drenched in blood and horror. So he explained the idealized versions of each of these faiths. And I did find it interesting. And by interesting, I mean, what the fuck? That in his chapter on Christianity, he said not once, but at least twice, something along the lines of ministers are needed to interpret the Bible, because if people read it for themselves, this might lead to individuality. Direct quote from the book, quote, "The other danger is that Christians will derive different truths from the Bible." Oh my God. The 900-odd denominations of Protestantism in the United States alone prove not only that this danger exists, but that it could conceivably slope toward complete individualism. Oh my God. People might be individuals, not carbon copies of a faith. Yeah, I'm having opinions about Mr. Smith. I have 2 more books of his in my library. I'm not sure how excited I am to read them now. And I have one of them set to read not in August, but in September. And I might push that one out. The other one I already plan to read like somewhere way down the line when I'm done with my religious studies, because it seemed like it would be a good summary of everything. But I have opinions about Mr. Smith right now. So, yeah, individualism, horrifying. He then clarifies that the vast majority of Protestants, something like 80% of Protestants, actually fall into about 12 denominations. Now, understand, and again, backed up by the CIA, we technically have Christianity as a whole has broken into more or less 3 large divisions, and then there's subdivisions under those. So you have Christianity, you have Catholicism, you have the Orthodox churches, and then you have Protestantism. So I love the beer, but it's making me burp. Catholicism is its own standalone, and there actually are offshoots of Catholicism that you, especially in the Middle East. Actually, you have the Maronite Church. The Maronite, okay, so they're Eastern Rite churches. So the Maronite Church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church. This is the CIA thing. I printed off and highlighted all the religions so that I would have something to look at and not be flipping screens and stuff. So the Catholicism has those, that they have a couple of other ones, but basically they are a Latin-based church. The Orthodox Church, where you'll see like the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, even the Ukrainian Orthodox, take their base from Greek. All right, so the Greek was the primary language of that church. So that was the first basic split, was the Catholicism and the Orthodox. And then from Catholicism, the Protestants broke off, and that was primarily Luther, Calvin, and Henry VIII in England gave us the Church of England, which then jumped the ship over to the United States with Puritanism, Baptism, is it Episcopalian? Yeah. Latter-day Saints, those are all considered Protestantism because they're not part of the mother church in Rome, if you will. 85% of all Protestants fall into about 12 denominations under Protestantism, but damn those individuals for not pumping those numbers up to 90, 95%. Like stupid people reading the Bible. Unfortunately for him, the Puritans, that was their grand plan, like back, Jesus, to the 2021. Yes, 2021, when I read the book American Nations? I think that was the name of it. Where that author, Colin something, he said the Puritans actually wanted high literacy because they wanted their people to be able to read the Bible and know the Word of God for themselves, but not Mr. Smith, apparently. The laity are too fucking stupid to read it for themselves and know what it means. Now, having said all of that and having spent the last, 10 minutes bashing him, I am going to say that I learned more about Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism than I had known before. I mean, I learned what was considered yoga, which is not just, nifty positions. There are actual individual thoughts that go with the 4 yogas. The way to God through knowledge, the way to God through love, the way to God through work, and the way to God through psychophysical exercises, which would be the nifty poses. So knowledge is just reading, basically, which is what I'm doing. So I'm going to find God through one way or the other. I'm going to find God through books. Through love, love thy neighbor. It's not self-love. I mean, you should love yourself, but it's love through the external locus, finding love in the people around you. Love your enemy, love your neighbor. Finding God through work, doing good works. You can find God through dedicating yourself to God's works. And then the, nifty poses. You can be a yogi. I learned about different types of Buddhism, not just Tantric. Tantric is actually a smaller subset of it. It's the tiniest part. The 4 noble virtues of Buddhism is loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and joy in the happiness and well-being of others. It's basically just being a happy person, right? Which is not to say you can never be mad because you're human, but generally it's shooting for that happiness, that level of happiness, that being loving towards others, finding compassion for your fellow man, equanimity, joy in the happiness. And then there's 2 major types of Buddha, which is Theravada and Mahayana. I'm probably mispronouncing those. Theravada is self-responsibility, all right? And primarily Theravadas are going to be like Buddhist monks, all right? These are the ones who withdraw from the world and turn inwards to try and find God. You're in charge of your own journey. Wisdom is your key virtue. You're seeking that level of knowledge and wisdom. It requires constant commitment. Buddha is seen as a saint and a teacher, but not necessarily as a savior. Practice is focused on meditation. Mahayana seeks support from the divine powers and focuses on compassion. So there's again that compassion for your fellow man, right? Or woman. There is a slight focus on converting others, although certainly not to the proselytizing degree of Christianity or Islam. But there is a focus on converting others because you yourself are seeking out bodhisattva, which means basically you're the last man standing as you bring others to nirvana. And he includes a very nice, I don't want to say anecdote, but it's like a story from Buddhist thought on when people find nirvana, and the Theravadas, they find nirvana and they immediately jump over the garden wall and run into nirvana, versus the Mahayana who goes, no, I have to bring others to nirvana. And so they go out into the world and proselytize, if you will, and bring others to nirvana. In Mahayana, Buddha is seen as a savior, so not just a saint, but a savior, and there is a focus on metaphysics and prayer, so it's more church-like, if you will. And then the chapter on Taoism, I learned that Tao has like a 3-fold path of their own. The ultimate reality, Tao is the ultimate reality, Tao is the way of the universe, and Tao is the way of human life. So this book was really a mixed bag for me, is what I'm saying here. I mean, there were some things I learned that I didn't know before. It does cover the 7 religions mentioned, but leaves out some of the more foundational religions that are still in existence. Like, I'm fine with him not mentioning, like, the extremely obscure religions. Like, on Reddit the other day, I saw a post from somebody who said he was, hang on a second, I should have written this down, but I didn't, and now it'll be easy to find. Hang on. A post on somebody who is a, quote, Mesopotamian polytheist. Now, Mesopotamia is not just a dead religion, it's a dead culture. It's been dead since before the Greeks were a thing. It's that old. I mean, it predates ancient Egypt. I am okay that he did not include Mesopotamian polytheism as a religion in his book. That's a very niche thing. I did ask the individual who posted that, you know, what books do you have on that? I'm not even sure if I'll get to them because, again, very obscure. I may read, actually, because I'll probably read Gilgamesh, because that is one of the world's oldest myths. Again, predates most everything. It's one of the world's oldest written myths, which still got a new chapter before George R.R. Martin finished his book. So just give it up, guys. He's never going to finish it. But Zoroastrianism, I think that actually predates Judaism and is still practiced today. It's a very, very tiny group of people who practice it in Iran, which is profoundly brave of them, given that Iran is like 98% Islam. But Zoroastrianism is very much still a thing. I have the CIA source book right here. Zoroastrianism. Okay, all right, Judaism predates it, but it was from the 9th or 10th century BC. Actually, the CIA says it may be the oldest continuing creedal religion. It is primarily worshipped in Iran, India, where there is Parsi, and Pakistan. So that's what I have for Zoroastrianism, but it's still very much a thing. So it's one of the world's oldest religions. And they actually do have a book because, again, I have it. Sikhism, which he mentions in the chapter on Hindu, I put the wrong religion here, as being an offshoot of Hinduism, which I don't think is accurate because it came about in like the 10th century Common Era. So I don't know that it's necessarily an offshoot of Hinduism. Shinto is mentioned exactly once in the book, twice if you count if you include the ism Shintoism, but he mentions it in the bit on primal religions, even though, again, most of Japan identifies as Shinto. No, not quite half of Japan identifies as Shinto, right? Jainism and Baha'i are the other two religions that the CIA identifies that he doesn't even mention. So I actually do have another book that does mention those. I'm going to read that one next month just to give myself a thorough grounding in what exactly I'm getting into here. This is going to take a couple of years. So, hey, good news for my 493 followers. I got a couple more years reading out of this, so yay. There is no real timeline as to when various religions sprang up, other than to mention when various prophets were born and lived. That's the closest you get to an actual timeline, is this prophet was born here, and this is how his religion came about. I went through the CIA's fact book to get an idea of what other religions were not deemed worthy of mention by the great scholar. And I actually did know about Zoroastrianism from a fictional book I read, believe it or not, called... that one was Doom. It's by Jacqueline Carey. It's not Kushiel's Dart. That was the first one. Kushiel's Avatar, maybe? And it's very romantic-y, smutty, better than 50 Shades of Grey, but still a little slightly creepy with indications of child sexual abuse. Just trigger warning if you need that. But she mentions Zoroastrianism, and so I was like, is that really a thing? Because a lot of her work actually has some very interesting intertwinings of religion and, BDSM, if you're into that kind of thing. Anyways, that is it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.